Hey guys, wanted to just talk to you a little bit about the Trans-Saharan trade routes, where they basically traded salt for gold in the Middle Ages in Africa. I wanted to show you a picture of, they still do this today. The salt isn't in powder form like we have it. They were in these big, like thin chunks of salt. You had to make them thin like this so that they would carry on either side and balance out on the camel. Plus, if you made them too big and it rained, then that would hold, it would get too heavy because salt would hold the water. So these small pieces are what they still use it today. So these would be loaded on camels. And of course, this was found up in the north, and this gold was found down in West Africa. And this is how the West African empires got so big. So let's kind of take a look at what we got. So we notice up here we have North Africa, plenty of good land to farm and that. And down here is West Africa. And this is where Ghana and then Mali and then Songhai, these three empires will start. Here's the city of Timbuktu, super rich city that got rich by the trade of gold and salt. Here's one of the main salt mines, though there were many up here too. Anyway, they would travel about 1,200 miles back and forth across the Sahara Desert here, bringing all these different items. And then, of course, the Muslims, the Arabs, started getting involved in the trade too. So that started to come through this way. So let's go ahead and start taking some notes. So Trans-Saharan trade, basically trans means across. So it just means across the Sahara Desert. It started around the AD 1000s to 1100s, lasted a few hundred years. It was very difficult to cross. Of course, it's the world's largest desert, and it was really difficult. In fact, it wasn't really till the 1000s that they were able to get to have the technology to do it. Two reasons that they were able to. One was because the introduction of camels into the area, where they got from the Middle East and also from earlier from the Romans. Camels were faster, so before they were carrying that salt by people called porters, who were basically slaves carrying the salt by hand. So the camels could carry more and a lot faster. And of course, we know that camels are designed to go long distances without water and food. Another thing that made it possible, this Trans-Saharan trade, was the spread of Islam, the religion. As it spread throughout North Africa and then down into West Africa, it gave it a common language so that all these different African people were able to communicate better, and there was less conflict. Once that everybody basically became Muslim, there was no more conflict, so that made things better. Some of the things that were traded from the north came weapons, some of them from the Europeans, but also from the iron weapons that were being created, and then salt. And that was a big one. Remember, salt was just as valuable as gold. People needed it to stay alive. Your body needs salt, but more important also, it was a way of preserving their meat and their right. So because there's no refrigeration. From the West Africa, there was lots of gold. Still is gold there. So they were sending back gold and jewelry, and unfortunately, human beings as slaves. And they were sending the slaves up to North Africa, but also into the Middle East. This trade route will last about 300 years until about the 1400s. And then that will end during the Renaissance, when shipping and maritime routes, like being able to sail easily and efficiently, there's no longer a need to go through the desert as much. So that's when the Trans-Saharan desert or trade ends. Just keep in mind, once again, like the trade. So West Africa is sending up north. They are sending gold, jewelry, and slaves up to North Africa, and from West Africa all the way to the Middle East. And the North African people are sending mostly salt and some weapons. Okay, so that's what's happening. There are some important people that will bring Islam to West Africa. The people of Ghana, the first empire, they did not want Islam. They wanted their own African traditional religion, and that actually caused war, and eventually the Muslims will defeat Ghana. The next empire, Mali, was run by Sundiata Keita, known as the Lion King, the Lion Prince. He doesn't force Islam on his people, but he accepts it because he knows if he does, it'll increase trade with the Arabs. So he's smart. He's like, let's get along with these guys because we'll make lots of money. Shortly after Sundiata Keita came their greatest ruler, Mansa Musa. He worked hard. He really was a devout Muslim. He makes a big pilgrimage to Mecca. He brings all this gold just to show off to the rest of Africa how rich Mali was. And also on his way back, he brings back a whole bunch of Muslim teachers and writers to spread Islam in Mali. He really wants Mali to become Islamic. After Mali falls, it becomes Songhai. And Sunni Ali's kind of the one who gets Songhai started. He is a Muslim. He still doesn't push it on his people, but more and more of the people in Songhai become Muslim. And then when Askia Muhammad becomes the ruler, there is no choice. He makes it an Islamic nation, brings about 150 schools down to teach the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, and he makes it an Islamic nation where there's no choice. So at that point, Islam is in charge. It has the power, it has the salt, it has the gold, and it's sending slaves back and forth. It is very rich and powerful. Okay. When it came to African slavery, we usually think of American, right? Africans being sent to America. But before that, Africans were enslaving their own people. The Bantu people down in the rainforest in Central Africa would raid towns and capture other African people, other tribes that were different from them. They would also send their criminals and prisoners of war, and they sent these people in slavery up to the north and into the Middle East. Once the Muslims come in and begin to take over and take power, they begin to enslave people too. Now, the Quran says that you're not allowed to, that's their holy book, right? It says you're not allowed to enslave Muslims, but you are allowed to enslave non-Muslims. And so that's what they did. They began to round up and, capture and sell Africans. Now, you could, if you were a non-Muslim, you could convert and become a Muslim to save yourself from slavery. But these slaves then were taken to North Africa and all throughout the Middle East. Some of the historians believe the numbers were higher than the amount of Africans brought to the Americas, but still a horrible thing that happened. Now, the difference in this slavery is not as brutal and as harsh as it was in America. So in African slavery, you could actually, as a slave, win your freedom through hard work. You could marry a free person and become freed and not a slave. And also your children typically didn't become slaves. That wasn't true in America. You couldn't get your freedom back. You couldn't marry and become free. And your children in America were slaves. So American slavery was much more harsh and brutal. So the Europeans get involved in the slave trade in 1441 by the Portuguese, which is Portugal is just below Spain. And at first, the slaves just were sent to Portugal. They were mostly house servants. They weren't being used out in the fields. And then there were some islands off the coast of Africa that Portugal got a hold of. And they found that these African people worked really hard and would work on the sugarcane plantation, if you will. And they did a great job, and it was made the Portuguese very rich. Well, eventually Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, and the Portuguese and the Spanish begin to send just by the millions slaves to the West Indies, which were the islands in between South America and North America. Majority of slaves ended up in South America. I think they say about 10% of the African slaves ended up in America. But they worked on the sugarcane plantations down in the West Indies. Brutal, hard work. Many of them died on the way over. Many of them died doing the work. It was a really horrible time in both South American and North American history. And then, of course, when the American colonies began to get powerful and rich, the southern colonies really needed more people to do work for their crops down on the plantations, things like cotton, rice, and tobacco. And so the slaves began to be brought into the Americas. And you'll learn a lot more about American slavery next year in 8th grade, but that's how that all began. It started in Africa, African people selling their own people into slavery, the Muslims selling many of these African people into North Africa and into Middle East, and then eventually the Europeans, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then eventually the English, the British will get involved in buying Africans as well. So that's just a little bit of beginnings of that injustice that was felt really on all those continents. You think about it in Asia, Middle East, Europe, Africa, South America, and North America. Pretty horrible time in the human history. So anyway, I hope you learned something, and we'll see you soon. All right. Have a good day.